We're live.
All right.
All right, so welcome to the first episode of We the Individuals, where we are dedicated to the novel proposal that we each choose our own manner of being governed. We are going to be talking about some of the topics that strike our fancy, and tonight for the first episode, we of course picked one of our favorite libertarian punching bags, Bernie Sanders. So for those who don't know me, my name is Chris Calton. I'm one of the moderators at We the Individual, and you can also find some of my own projects at the YouTube channel Anarchris. With me, of course, is the owner and founder of We the Individuals, Jeff Peterson II, hated in the left libertarian community, I'm sure, and ambiguously homosexual to the rest of us. And then, of course, joining us as well would be Will Tippins and Andy Catherman, who I'm still getting to know, so I'm going to let them introduce themselves a little bit, but they are also moderators at We the Individuals. So without further ado, gentlemen, I would like to start by hearing each of you, if you can, just give me a little introduction to yourself, since I don't know you guys that well other than Jeff. And I would like to hear just a brief take before we get into the specific details on just your thoughts, the good, bad, and the ugly of Bernie Sanders. What are his pros and what are his cons from a libertarian standpoint? Will, let's start with you.
I cut out there for a second, but I assume you just wanted an intro and general thoughts.
General thoughts on Bernie Sanders, and just introduce yourself a little bit if you can.
Okay, well, Will Tippins, I am, as you said, I'm not fully acquainted with you and Andy. I've known Jeff through his impassioned rants against the left libertarian movement, and just
Well, most of us know him.
yeah, well, just been a fan, but so I'm a recent law graduate, basically stuck in purgatory after taking the bar, and Bernie Sanders is to me just another same talking head, not a whole lot really, not a whole lot special about him, and that's really what bugs me is the comparisons that he gets to someone like Ron Paul as someone who I consider a real outsider. But that being said, he does have some different. He's not as simple, he's not as one-dimensional as a lot of the other candidates that we see kicked around. But so that's just my general take on it. But
okay, so you would say he's different than the rest of them, but he's not the identical, typical politician that we're used to seeing, which I think is fair. Jeff, are you having some connectivity issues?
Oh no, I just needed to get my headset. So you guys.
Oh yeah, cool. Yeah, do that after we start. I guess that means Andy. Let's hear from you.
Yeah, sure. My name is Andy Catherman. I am a software developer, application developer by day, and I am a father by night. And when I have my free time, which is usually never, I am interested in liberty and economics and ethics. And so happy to be a part of this, and humbled that you guys would think of me to do this with me. So with that said, I'm sure we'll be getting to know each other a lot more throughout the course of this podcast, or whatever we want to call it, screencast. And as far as my thoughts on Bernie Sanders, I think he's definitely. I think there's a couple of things I like to say about Bernie Sanders in general. I think it's interesting that he is in the race at all. He's kind of older, and I think before the whole this run, I think most people would have written him off as kind of a crazy old guy who has messed up hair. But I think it's interesting. Obviously, it's kind of like the Trump effect. There's just something about him and what he's saying, how he's connecting with people, that is somewhat attractive. Now I have tons of things to say negatively about his ignorance on many things morally and economically, but at least he's it's interesting that he's anything but Hillary Clinton, although he probably shares a lot more in common than people think. So I'll leave it at that for this round of commentary.
Sure. No. All right, Jeff. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think Will and Andy touched base on a couple of things, and when it comes to Bernie Sanders, I think that my biggest grievance, one of my grievances with him, is not necessarily him, but a lot of his supporters actually will come out and say he's talking about a lot of the issues that that aren't being discussed, such as wealth inequality, and that's pretty much the whole liberal Democrat spiel is wealth inequality and the 1%, and that's in a way true, but although he's talking about it doesn't mean that's necessarily a good thing, and I think that he has what the problem is a little bit figured out, but his solutions for solving these problems, like all statists and leftists, would just make the problems worse. It's just like Milton Friedman's timely quote of how I forget his exact words, how he says that they confuse the policies with the good intentions and policies with the outcomes and everything. So that's pretty much my beef with him. And then also I'm a little bit more biased against the left as well. So that's my that's my opinions on Bernie Sanders.
If I can interject, I think a lot what bugs me about Bernie Sanders is that in a lot of ways it's kind of like the Occupy Wall Street movement, because they have a lot of, as you said, they see issues that should be seen. They diagnose problems, they just can't come up with the solutions that make sense, and they often advocate more of what is actually the root cause of the problem instead of actually doing anything new or different or radical. So to me that's the frustration. The frustrating part is just it's sort of circular of his supporters laud him as some sort of new wave thinking type of guy, but he's a revolutionary without revolutionary ideas, I guess.
I think that's kind of a funny thing that I'll see is that I'll hear his campaign and his supporters say that it's a grassroots campaign, and it's like you got to make up your mind. It's either a grassroots campaign or he's a socialist statist Democrat. You can't have both. Ron Paul was grassroots because you saw people like I remember seeing Ron Paul for the first time. I was on the freeway. Someone made like a homemade marker sign, Google Ron Paul, and that's the first time I heard of it. And someone who calls in for more government intervention is at
anything but iconic
grassroots. Right.
Yeah.
I mean,
cool.
Google Bernie Sanders and what are what's the big idea? I mean,
All right, let me jump in so we can kind of get into the nuts and bolts of this. So what I'm going to do for the people watching this is I'm going to play the role of the libertarian socialist, because I know as libertarians a lot of us are hearing some of these arguments for why libertarians should, under some circumstances, support Bernie Sanders. So that's kind of what I want to tackle today, how you guys are going to respond to those arguments. I wore my Che Guevara shirt just for this occasion, so I'm really diving into the role of the socialist tonight. So I want to start with one of the ones that I've heard the most as a college student myself, and Will, I'm sure you'll have an opinion on this since you just got out of law school, and that's his plan for college tuition, where he's advocating essentially a single-payer system for college tuition, just like he's advocating single-payer health care. Well, let's start with you again, since you are just recently graduated. What do you think about this system? Should libertarians support this at all?
Oh, okay. Well, that's one of those multi-layered arguments, really. But I mean, you look at the system that we have in place, and there is so much intervention and regulation and distortions through the artificially low state-sponsored loans. And I have so many friends who were in undergraduate, especially a couple years longer than I was, who are swamped with just so much debt, and they have degrees that essentially are worth less than the fake the fake calfskin that they're printed on. So I mean, it's on one hand, I guess you have to hand it to Bernie. He's at least trying to think a little outside the box. I mean, we were talking about the other day, the single-payer healthcare system, while it fails for all the reasons that all central planning fails. I mean, one could make the argument that it's superior to the mixed system that we currently have, at least in the short run. But anyways, no, I don't have
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. Your last statement, where it might be better than the mixed system, because that's some of the arguments I'm hearing. There are a lot of people that said, well, yeah, in a perfect world, and Ancapistan perhaps, it would be better if this were left up entirely to the free market. But we could acknowledge, with I mean, just the student loan debt that so many of us are burdened with because of this mixed, this corporatist system that, as I would call it. Would it not be better, if we can't have a purely free market, to at least have this single-payer system? So maybe it's not as good as it could be, but it would be better than what it have. Jeff, I'd like to hear your diatribe on this. What do you have for me?
As far as it being better than what we have, I think intentions-wise, I think it might be better, but in practice, in economics and everything, I disagree. I think as far as free college in general is that, if looking at it, a college costs, rise faster than other prices precisely because college is being substantially socialized. And you see the same thing in every other semi-socialized good or service. I mean, like Will was touching base on, you take healthcare, prices go up and quality goes down. Because the people consuming it aren't the ones paying for it. So you don't have to produce a quality product to make money. You can raise prices and without losing customers, and the value of college education will plummet even further. So, I think they say, in a nutshell, I just think they have, their good intentions are put in front of them a little bit more than they're just going to create more of the same problem.
And just to clarify, I certainly I didn't mean it to sound as if I would advocate single-payer healthcare or for an education system, but I do think that there is an interesting argument that could be made by I don't know, like a Steve Horowitz type, I would imagine, but I think especially with education that the problem is so deep-reaching. It's sort of a fundamental question of what we even view what is education. I mean, what is it other than human capital that that happens to begin early in life? So I mean, when we have this conception that we have in America today of what education is, this rigid, formal, 12, 18 years, it's almost like a prison sentence, with the mandatory attendance and all that. So really, it's difficult. That's the fundamental problem is starting somewhere when everything is so far from what you would consider a free society might consider education to be.
Well, yes. Let me hear a little bit from Andy, but Andy, I want to narrow this just a little bit further and say, would there not be some benefits at least? Yeah, I mean, we can talk about the economic consequences of it, which I think most of us are going to agree on, but would there not be at least some benefit if everybody were able to go out and get a college degree? I mean, isn't that a plus that we can acknowledge as capitalist libertarians?
Well, I mean, I'm not really going to say who is going to be the net beneficiaries, but like in any socialized type system, there's gonna be winners and losers. It's just kind of as an economist, we would look at, given such and such edict or decree or policy, who are going to be the losers, who are going to be the winners. So maybe just offhand, this is going to be, it's pretty much going to unionize, if not all, or not unionize, but it's going to obviously incentivize and reward all of the teachers. In the sense that they're going to.
Is that bad?
No, I mean I'm saying those are going to be the winners.
Sure.
So that's going to, think of it as like a job safety forever. So I don't even know if they have tenure. I think they do have some. You have tenure in college for professors. So I would expect that would just skyrocket as far as, and I'm not really sure how if the government is taking over all of funding. What's going to happen? So are all those endowed chairs going to just kind of be irrelevant? So that's the question about what it's all going to be about how resources are going to be allocated and how what's this going to do for as the quality of education as well. If you look at high school or elementary school education, it's almost a single payer system. If not, it is. So we can look at the effects of that. You know, it's just poor results, more money being thrown at it, and pretty much the same quality or value, if not going downward. So you know, so I think it's going to make a lot of private institutions more part of the government arm, or part of being public employees. So that might be obviously a negative. It's going to disincentivize a lot of like cheap, low-cost forms of education. As a software developer, I can tell you that the market for learning how to code yourself is really vibrant. So if this is going to come along, I think that's going to squash a lot of budding entrepreneurs that are creating really cool screencast type ways of self-teaching yourself. At least that's my experience from a software developer. So, and then lastly, I'm going to say that which the government subsidizes is going to control. So it's going to have a huge amount of influence on what is going to be taught, if it are more than what it does right now. So those are just a few of the things that I would say about trying to identify some winners and losers, at least from an economic
one thing that Andy touched base on that I think is worth noting is that how he said he's a software developer is just kind of brings upon a point, is that, like, you know, if you say, for instance, that making widgets is a $100,000 a year job for whatever combination of reasons, government comes along and says, you know, we need to make everyone a widget maker, everybody will be well off. Let's send everyone to widget making school. The price of those schools would skyrocket, the quality of its product, or the education in this case, would plummet, and the market would be flooded with widget makers. The wages of the widget makers would correspondingly plummet at the same time, and the whole rest of the market is just going to the production of all the goods and services would suffer as everybody, you know, stops making whatever else they might have.
Sure. Okay, well, let's move on to a different topic then. I kind of wanted to start with a softball question, but here's the one I'm really interested in, because this is one that I think some libertarian advocates for Bernie Sanders have a valid point on, and that's some of his foreign policy issues. Andy, we'll start with you again since you spoke last time, but Bernie Sanders seems to have a pretty good track record on foreign intervention, on war. His voting record is pretty non-interventionist, certainly relative to the other candidates. Is that not a reason itself to support him as a libertarian?
Yeah, I think so. I one of the reasons why I think I've come along to the libertarian libertarian as it is because of my realization that war is just one of the most immoral acts there is out there, most heinous things that the state does. You know, it's just terrible. So I think, if anything, that's probably the most virtuous thing any leftists or any people on the socialist side, if they are really, truly, honestly for peace and for maybe staying out of other people's affairs, whether it's in the Middle East or whatever, I think that's definitely something to support them on.
Okay, so maybe there is some merit to some of these. I know I've got one of the articles by a Reason writer pointing up, and he points out his record on war voting. So Jeff, do you agree?
As far as Bernie Sanders, I was bittersweet to find out that, you know, he actually voted against the Iraq War, because when I say bittersweet is because I don't like him, and I don't want to have reasons to agree with him.
Sure.
But anyways, I like the fact that he was for the Iraq War, and he was somewhat similar to Ron Paul as far as going after the people who were responsible for 9/11. So what I would say that I didn't really like when I went onto Bernie Sanders' website today and found out some of his foreign policy is that he. And on the website, it was actually seeming to say we need to kind of, you know, protect our interests, you know, abroad and fight terrorism. So although he didn't seem as much as a war hawk as neoconservatives or what Obama's been since he's been in office, I would say that some of what he was actually advocating for would, in a way, still have some blowback towards our country, because although he's not, like I said, not as much as a war hawk, when I was reading his website, it was kind of saying that he would want to go and, for instance, want to kind of be a peacemaker, and as the U.S. should be kind of leading and being a peacemaker, and I think that's just going to create more problems. So in a way, I do agree with him and commend him on where he's done well, but looking at his website today and on the issues, I kind of was thinking that what he would be proposing is going to be probably more of what we've been receiving from Obama and Bush, is because at first you want to try and create peace by diplomacy, it's not going to work, and then you're just going to keep, kind of like what Ron Paul said, you can't fight an idea, you can't fight terrorism, you can't, there's one interview that he said with someone who when he was criticizing the war policy, and the lady asked Ron Paul, he said someone was asking Ron Paul, wouldn't you want to go after the people who caused it? And he says, who caused it? And he says, the terrorists. And he mentioned you can't fight an idea. So if you're gonna go after the terrorists in general, or terrorism, it's just going to be an endless war on terrorism. So he was good on Afghanistan and Iraq, so I can see why libertarians side with him there. But I think that down the road with what he proposes, it'll just be more of the same.
So would it be fair to say, if I can sum up your position concisely, and you tell me if I'm getting it right here, his voting record is legitimately relatively solid on this area, but some of his stated positions seem to be the same vague bromides we see from all the other politicians that kind of make him seem maybe a little bit more wishy-washy? Is that what I'm hearing from you?
Yeah, exactly. So I agree that he was, his voting record is great, but based off, his proposals, I could automatically give him, a Nobel Peace Prize based off his proposals. But look who got the last Nobel Peace Prize for being a presidential candidate.
Two of them. Hey, he's getting a second one, isn't he? Okay, sorry, I'm going to get off the track.
I have one question for Jeff, since he's kind of more familiar with Bernie's, his stances and stuff. Would you say that he's more like a pro-UN type of guy to handle foreign affairs?
I was reading, like I said, I was reading his website, and when I found out, he mentioned the words, and it kind of made me cringe, because it said world government type thing. I'm not going to say it said the words world government, but he was invoking kind of a world UN type international type of thing that I could not get on board with that. I was like, oh.
Maybe I think the reason why I'm lukewarm on, like all of you have said, his voting record is pretty clean, but there are a couple of spots. I mean, I believe there was Kosovo, and
Kosovo is one that I remember hearing about. Yeah,
I get the idea that his support for peace and non-intervention is not from a principled stance of non-intervention. I mean, I have no doubt that he believes. I mean, he almost certainly. I mean, he demonstrably believes in collective security at home, whether you're talking about borders or whatever. So I would be very wary of his stances towards, whether you're talking about the UN or NATO or any other. I mean, it's very Wilsonian from what I can tell, not nearly as interventionist, at least not outright. But if it came down to quote-unquote altruistic intervention or anything that maybe for some sort of human rights violations overseas, and of course that's most of the justifications these days, I certainly wouldn't. It wouldn't surprise me all that much for someone of, because once again I think it just comes from his. It's kind of, he just feels it out, I think, more than it's a strict. I hate to say, a Noam Chomsky type of, if you're talking about other leftists who have a much more, I think, grounded principles of non-intervention. So once again, I don't think that his is that reliable, just judging from the couple of blotches that he does have on his record.
Sure. Okay, so let's jump into another one that I know we Austrians like, and that's banking. Another thing he claims to be very, very against the big investment banks. Now, I always think the Federal Reserve here. Obviously, generally, as Austrians, we're going to be against the central bank, the Federal Reserve, and any banks that receive any form of like government-sponsored privileges. In that regard, I don't think that's necessarily what Bernie Sanders is saying, but he's certainly against some of the big banking industry to some degree. Would you guys not agree with that? Is that not a merit of his?
He's certainly pissed off, and to give him credit for that, I guess, I mean, I think that's part of his appeal. Like you were comparing him to Trump earlier, he's mad as hell, and he's not going to take it anymore. The only thing is, it's kind of like the Occupy Wall Street people, is that they're occupying on Wall Street and not in Washington. So I mean, he's angry for the right reasons, or at least part of the right reasons. It's just he's not taking it out on the right people for the right. For
Jeff, is he right about the banks?
I agree as an Austrian, that if I think that allowing the banks to fail and cleaning the market with all that waste and misallocation of resources is a great thing. If companies want to take on risk and they fail, then just like the video. Hayek versus Keynes in this round 2, how he says, capitalism is about profit and loss. We in a market society, in a free and laissez-faire capitalist society, if a bank was to fail, then they should fail. One thing I was noticing, I'm not sure how accurate this is, because there seems to be this Facebook meme school of economics that seems to go around, that they just post a meme and it's automatically true. So I didn't investigate it as much, but from my understanding, as I did some searching, and it found out that although he's against big banks, he opposed the auditing of the Fed, which is the culprit of all the like, for instance, he rallies about the 2008 financial crisis and blames Wall Street, and he wants to go after the bankers, but he opposes the audit the Fed bill, or auditing the Fed, when it's pretty much the bank that's giving everyone the alcohol that's getting drunk off of it. So, like Will said, he has a focus on the right problem, but he's got a wrong prescription and a wrong diagnosis.
Every big bank except for that one that has government privileges. Is that what it is? It reminds me of Elizabeth Warren. I know she's similar position. She's going to gripe all day about the big banks, but she's not standing up to the Federal Reserve. I know he did also oppose the bailouts, and Andy, I'll hear your thoughts on this. This reminded me a little bit of Ron Paul. Ron Paul actually took, well, if we can't have this, at least let's have this position on the bailouts. He said, I disagree with the bailout, but even if we're going to spend that money, like, it would be better to give it to the people holding the mortgages, not the banks. And that seems to be Bernie Sanders' position. Obviously, he would just absolutely advocate giving it to the people, not giving it back to the taxpayers. But it still was very similar, I thought, to Ron Paul's position in terms of opposing the bailouts, which is, let's not give it back to the Wall Street CEOs, let's not give it back to these big banks. What do you think about his opposition to the bailouts in context of?
Well, I think it parallels a lot of other things that, like, you're sort of on board, like you're like, yeah, but then there's like a little hint of skepticism. Be like,
yeah,
he can't quite be right on this. There's got to be something he's missing. And, like, for example, a lot of people that are anti-Fed, they want to have the Treasury print money instead of having like a quote private bank that has the monopoly privilege to print and coin money or whatever. So I'd need to know a little bit more. Like I'd be interested to know why he was like one of Ron Paul's, like, kind of co-sponsors in the Senate for auditing the Fed, and then he backed out at the wrong time. Like, did somebody twist his arm and then he caved in, or what was that? I need to know. So I claim a little ignorance as far as I need to understand a little bit better where he's coming from, what are his principles, which I'm sorry, I'm just skeptical that they're going to be sound in any way, shape, or form. Obviously, if he wants to revoke certain privileges to big banks or those sorts of things, I'm for those sorts I'm for that. But again, I think there's a difference between supporting somebody that has like a bill that's like an audit of the Fed versus entrusting that somebody's going to be great on monetary policy, just because I'm skeptical of his economic grasp of banking in general. So I mean, does he know about fiat? Or I'm sorry, fractional reserve banking? Like that is to me is the key thing that has to go hand in hand with knowing why the Federal Reserve is bad, is because the only reason the Federal Reserve is there is to be a prop for these fractional reserve banks that are always going to be prone to collapse when there's a downturn, and they have to redeem all these, or they have to make good all these bad loans that went sour. So.
Okay, well, let me follow up on this then. So Bernie Sanders, of course, voted for all the spending bills. He calls himself a socialist, but he's clearly at least an extreme Keynesian. So he's voted for any stimulus package. I would posit that I think he knows exactly the relationship between the Federal Reserve and all these appropriations of spending in terms of make-work projects. He has that, making well-paying jobs on his website, and that's what he points to as his record on this. Do you think he knows that connection, or do you think there's just some cognitive dissonance between, I do oppose the banks, but on the other hand, I favor government spending, and I'm not going to ask where that money comes from?
Yeah, I think it's just rooted in like this populism, this left-leaning populism. And banks are a easy whipping boy, and especially the Federal Reserve. So I think it's a bit of cognitive dissonance, to be honest with you, and just not being able to coherently understand
so you
economics.
think he genuinely is unaware of the relationship between the Federal Reserve buying Treasury securities and where the government funds its deficits? And I don't know. I'm just wondering.
That's an interesting question. I don't know if I'd be capable to answer that, to be honest.
I myself don't know the answer to that question, because it's whenever someone in power does something really stupid, like I say, come on, you have to at least know basic, at least economics 101 to know that something like, if, and my position is that it's very tricky, is like, does he know what the results of actually the Federal Reserve and fractional reserve banking are, or does he really not know? So that makes me worried that he does know and he doesn't care, and that makes him a bad, evil person. Or is he just really ignorant, which makes me even worry more? Why would you want someone ignorant in power if they don't know what the heck is going on? But knowing that he's a demagogue, I think that with him wanting power, and of course the private sector or any form of the private sector is bad, I think that he's bashing the private sector, Citibank and U.S. Bank and all those banks that got money, but he sees the Federal Reserve as big brother, the government, the guy that's going to protect us from the bigger banks, and it's just kind of in a way class warfare, because he's going against the private sector, but for the benefit of actually protecting the government sector or the Federal Reserve. So, yeah. Like Andy, I can't answer that question as far as I don't know, but I've always wondered those things whenever something like this comes up.
Will, you look like you want to weigh in.
Well, when of course it's impossible to know. He may have well, Ron Paul was asked a few years ago how many people in all of Congress he thought actually really understood the way the Fed works. And he said it was maybe like 3 or 4 people. So, I tend to think that he's probably mostly, in the dark, because he does preach a lot about the evils of greed, and it'd be pretty difficult to reconcile, his crusade against those who wish to accumulate too much wealth and still be able to endorse what the Fed does. But at the same time, I think I as most progressives, I think he's more just blinded by his own ideology. It's very, very difficult to be a mercantilist or a protectionist if you don't have the power of the central bank, and so he's willing to probably turn a blind eye to the ill effects of the central bank, because he believes it is a necessary evil, so that he can carry on whatever policies he deems necessary to, protect. He sees himself as the great protector of the people, the people's champ, and I mean, it's the elitism. He believes that he knows better. He knows how to spend the wealthiest Americans' money better than the wealthiest Americans, and that's the whole 90% top tax bracket and all that. I mean,
I think Will has a point as far as the 3% of people in Congress that know that, because it just, in the grand scheme of things, I think you don't hire people to fix an economy, and it's not like the people are in charge or are unintelligent or corrupt. It's that there's people in charge. If you have to have people in charge, it'd be nice if they had a correct understanding of economics. But if that was the case, we just have people being in charge, and we'd have nothing to pay them for. They just sit around being in charge all day, and we'd have nothing to pay them for, because they would know with economics, you don't do anything to try and run an economy.
So, Will, you said something else I kind of want to hear some follow-up on. You referred to mercantilism. Do you think that Bernie Sanders is a mercantilist, or maybe a neo-mercantilist, as we would probably call it today?
Well, let's see. I was thumbing through some articles today on Bernie Sanders, because I try not to keep up too much with the day-to-day because it's depressing. But there was something that he tweeted several months ago, and he said, in the gift shops of, I guess it was in the Capitol building or somewhere in D.C., it says, in the gift shops, we should not be selling statues of founding fathers of this country that were made in China. So, I mean, that...
Yeah, was him, or was that Donald Trump? Because I get my xenophobic, nationalist...
I was thinking about, if I had more time and drive to come up with quotes from the Donald and Bernie, and, I bet there is at least a couple dozen that would overlap that, who said it? I mean, you could, it's a toss-up. I mean, the exact same mentality, it's just flipped in completely different rhetoric, I guess. But, I mean, if you asked me to define what a mercantilist was, I mean, that tweet pretty much embodies the entire spirit to me.
That's a good point.
Yeah, bring money back to the empire, right? I think that's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up. Okay, I want to kind of get into some of the closing questions I had here. We'll circle back around to Andy. So I like to bring up Walter Block's position when it comes to voting, because I admire Walter Block, and I don't think any of us can really question his libertarian credentials, but he often argues, and he's not supported Bernie Sanders, he supports Rand Paul, by the way, just for the record, so I'm not misrepresenting him, but he often argues what I think we heard from Murray Rothbard, which is there is some merit to voting, and there is some merit to voting for the lesser of two evils, or overseer goody versus overseer baddie. And I think there's some merit to this argument. I don't tend to vote myself just because I think it's useless. I don't think it's immoral. So I'm always kind of curious, people's reasoning behind who they're voting for. So, Andy, let's say the primaries are done, and it's Bernie Sanders versus Donald Trump. What do I do?
Oh. So you get the last question is going to be having to have analysis of the Donald and Bernie.
Okay, we're going to have
I think my head's going to explode.
Because I think Donald is the worst of the Republicans. I think Rand Paul, even though I'm not supporting him, is the best of the Republicans. So let's say Part A is Bernie versus Donald. Part B is Bernie versus Rand Paul. What do I do in each of those situations, and why?
Okay, so Bernie versus the Donald. Well, I do think in that case you do have an interesting debate of who has a better hair. So, so that might be
as good a reason to vote for somebody as I've heard yet.
That's a tough aesthetic question to answer. So, as far as Bernie versus, I think it really comes down to what's your real motivating reason to go to the polls. Like, do you just not want to have this person in, so you're voting for someone else?
So,
or are you
Rothbard, I think, just because I think we all admire Rothbard, he would say war. His big issue was always war more than anything else. Is that not a reason that a libertarian should vote for Bernie Sanders if he's running against Donald Trump?
Well, the reason that's a great segue to what I was going to say, because actually Walter Block, I think, said a few weeks ago or something that he actually voted for Obama.
Yeah, he did.
Over, I think, Romney, because he thought Obama
I
would
think it was
be, or not
McCain.
McCain. I'm sorry, you're right. He voted for Obama over McCain because he thought that Obama would be more of a dove than McCain, which I don't think you could argue with that logic. So I think I don't quite know, like Donald's what he says on foreign policy. It's kind of debatable. I've heard some people say that he's less hawkish than the others, but I just think he's more of a wild card. So I'm going to say I would actually. This saddens me. This kills me to say this. I probably would vote for Sanders if war is my number one thing that's driving me.
You're
And I do
saying
think
if war is your priority, you would vote for Sanders over Donald Trump.
I think so because I just don't know what he would do. I really don't know Donald Trump enough. Some people say that he'd actually be a lighter, less aggressive, less interventionist than all the other Republicans. And if that is the case, then
I have not heard that argument yet.
Nor have I.
All right,
So, yeah.
let me skip. Jeff, I'm going to come to you last because I'm really anxious to hear your response, but I want to save that for last. Will, what are your answers to questions A and B?
Okay, who to vote for? Sanders versus Trump?
Sanders versus Rand Paul, or anybody versus anybody.
And this is premised on the idea that if I don't vote, I'm going to get hands.
No, I'm skipping Jeff because I'm expecting he's going to say no vote, but maybe I'm displaying my hand here.
If you're threatening me with violence, then I guess I'll vote.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's North
premise
Korean elections now. You have to vote.
This has to have a gun to the head type of question.
Yeah. Okay. So one of those, but I think, and Block is as much as I really don't. Rand to me is so much more frustrating than someone like. Well, I don't want to say he's more frustrating than Bernie, but Rand, there was a lot of hopefulness there that he could really carry the torch, and so I just couldn't bring myself to vote for Rand. And also, I think that the argument that if Bernie Sanders was elected, it's probably, I do think that he would be less interventionist abroad, so that would be a plus. And also, his rhetoric, he is a self-described democratic socialist, or how, whatever combination of words he uses for the same effect. But so I think that the whatever bad things that are inevitably coming our way economically could be pinned on someone like Bernie. I think that could potentially really help what we're doing here. The intellectual cause, give people pause to really question what he's all about and what maybe the alternatives are. So maybe get all the socialism out of the common American voter system and rouse some curiosity, and who knows. So
well, that is actually an argument that I've made to people. Is like, at least Bernie Sanders is calling himself a socialist, so when he screws everything up, he's gonna screw everything up under the guise of socialism, whereas everybody else pretends to be Donald Trump's not exactly a free marketeer here, but he calls himself a capitalist.
And people have pegged Rand as some sort of off the wall radical. So
I mean, compared to Jeb Bush, maybe, but compared to Ron Paul, it's a lot more issue. And Walter Block, for all of his defense, it's purely pragmatic. He even acknowledges that he's very far. The apple fell far from the tree in that.
He gave him something like a 70 on his vaunted freedom.
Yeah, I read that post as well. Yeah. Okay, Jeff. Final word, man. Who would you vote for in this situation?
Oh well. As far as you touched base on me saying not voting, and one key thing that I would ever want to talk to someone there, and if we're kind of aiming this episode at the libertarian demographic that would support voting or Bernie, is that there's the whole idea that if we can get everyone at the same time to vote for the right person, then we'll have things our way. But I think that if you can, in order to do that, you have to change people's minds, and I think that if we can change everyone's minds, then voting is obsolete. So I kind of think that it's the argument can be made both ways. But anyway, as far as to address your question, I would say I would love to. In principle, I would want to vote for. I would say that as far as if Rand could get everything that he wanted to get done, then I would vote for Rand. However, I know that he one, his chances of winning are very small. Two, chances of him getting everything done are probably even a slimmer of a margin. And that being said, if he's in office and he gets nothing done, everyone, the consensus is going to say, see, libertarianism doesn't work. He was in office, he didn't get anything done, and that's going to be, that's going to be enough reason to condemn libertarianism. Second, if he gets in office and something bad happens, then libertarianism is going to get the blame. And so for the same reason as you and Will, I kind of would say I would prefer to see Sanders win, because I don't think, one, that we need efficiency experts for the government, because the less it sucks, the more people are going to get around, want to keep it. So I agree with Dan Sanchez and what he has to say. And then second, I would love to see, if under the guise of socialism it fails, and it would, people would have less reason to advocate socialism. So I'd probably want to let the this is going to sound bad to libertarians, but if the state runs amok and people can see how bad the state is, then they'll want to have the state around less.
Yeah, voting for the worst candidate to just speed up the collapse. I know I've heard that argument from some libertarians. I think Brian McClanahan, in one of his lectures that I listened to, he brought up that point. I don't know if he was advocating it, but he certainly brought it up. I always think it's an interesting point. I like the idea. I mean, I would rather see Bernie Sanders get elected if everything's just going to go to crap anyway. At least then it's called socialism. But I'm just going to give my answer to this question. If it were between Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump and there was a gun to my head, I'd probably just take the bullet. I mean, is that fair to say? Like, I think that might be the best course of action at that point.
I think one thing that even libertarians actually don't recognize, and there's this quote by Mises that says, "There's no ending." I don't know what his exact words is, that you can't stop a bubble from bursting once you're on the path of it actually collapsing. There's no means that can stop it. It's going to pop no matter what. The bubble will pop. So I think that, something bad may happen coming down the road. I'm not going to make a quantitative prediction, but I think that sometimes libertarians even forget that they think that by voting in Rand sometimes that they're going to stop a supposed bubble from popping, and there's no way that it can actually.
They might slow it, but they're probably not going to stop it.
Yeah, it's not going to. It's going to. The most you can do is eventually it'll actually pop. The most you can hope for is how bad it's going to be, and that's only determined on how long you want to prolong it. And
Jeff, it's not a bubble popping; it's just economic adjustment, right? So
it's correction. It's market corrections.
Sanitize.
Okay, so we're pretty much close to the end of our time. So 30 seconds. Will, give me your final thoughts here.
Final thoughts. I think I like this show. I mean, it's a cool format. Do you wanna give me more of a topic there?
Nope, just final thoughts, man. If that's what you got. I kind of meant final thoughts on Bernie Sanders, but we'll take it. Final thoughts on the show. Cool.
No. Let's see. Bernie. I think there's a lot more that could be said, but he's different, and I've something that I wanted to mention earlier. I also read this interesting article. He was actually fairly radical in the 70s. He was anti-compulsory schooling, and he's actually a lot more pro-gun than most leftists. So I mean, he's an interesting character, even though he's the crazy.
Karl Marx was pretty pro-gun, so maybe that's just part of his Marxism. Andy, final thoughts.
I think Bernie, I appreciate. I think one of you guys said, I'm not sure if it was you, Chris, or you, Will, or you, Jeff, he's an honest socialist. So he's explicit. I appreciate him versus like a Hillary Clinton who wants to, focus group all of her answers, even though she's really almost as socialist as somebody like a Bernie Sanders. But Bernie is explicit in his socialism, and he's a pretty standard democratic socialist of like a European bent. So I appreciate that aspect of him, and so it tells you exactly who he is. So, but one final comment on our show is I was just wanting to make a revelation that maybe we could add something to the show, like a subtitle, is "We the Individuals with Great Facial Hair." Since we're all supporting
prereq.
Modestly bearded gentlemen. Yeah.
Yes.
You see, that could have been a name for the show, Jeff. Why don't we come up with that? The Modestly Bearded Gentleman. Jeff, what are your final thoughts on Bernie?
I think as far as Bernie in general, it kind of makes me want to say that I think as far as final thoughts is for libertarians and any non-libertarians that would be watching this, it kind of stresses my importance on, learning economics, because for a reason like this, I mean, the average Joe doesn't think he or she cares about economic theory, but the same individual like Bernie won't hesitate to tell you about all the consequences of a policy change. I mean, libertarians and liberals in general have most of the same goals in terms of economic policy in mind. We want fewer poor people. We want the remaining poor to be better off, and so on. But we only generally disagree about means, and that's what economics is for. And then, so people only support social welfare programs because they, for some mind-boggling reason, according to some economic theories, they probably don't even realize they're using, that those are the best and only ways to help the poor or disadvantaged. So I think it makes me stress on that's the importance of learning economics, and
Sure.
That's my final thoughts on him.
Who cares who you vote for? Go read Go read Mises, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's what economics is for, is finding out what the,
Sure.
I mean, we all have the same goals, but we can find out what those means are, and economics is probably the best way of doing that.
Well said, well said.
Okay, cool. Well, I think that's going to wrap it up for today. For anybody watching, thank you for tuning in to our first episode of this. I know this is going to be posted on We the Individuals. Since this is our first episode, we're kind of getting some tweaks out. We would love to hear some input, and if anybody has some topics they'd be interested in hearing about, we are trying to compile a good running list of things worth talking about for about 45 minutes. So give us your input, leave us some feedback, and we'll be back next week, Jeff. Is that right?
Yes, we will.
Cool. All right. We'll see you then. Thanks for coming on, guys.
We're live.
All right.
All right. So welcome to the first episode of We the Individuals, where we are dedicated to the novel proposal that we each choose our own manner of being governed. We are going to be talking about some of the topics that strike our fancy. And tonight, for the first episode, we, of course, picked one of our favorite libertarian punching bags, Bernie Sanders. So for those who don't know me, my name is Chris Calton. I'm one of the moderators at We the Individual, and you can also find some of my own projects at the YouTube channel Anarchris. With me, of course, is the owner and founder of We the Individuals, Jeff Peterson II, hated in the left libertarian community, I'm sure, and ambiguously homosexual to the rest of us. And then, of course, joining us as well would be Will Tippins and Andy Catherman, who I'm still getting to know, so I'm going to let them introduce themselves a little bit, but they are also moderators at We the Individuals. So without further ado, gentlemen, I would like to start by hearing each of you, if you can, just give me a little introduction to yourself, since I don't know you guys that well other than Jeff. And I would like to hear just a brief take before we get into the specific details on just your thoughts, the good, bad, and the ugly of Bernie Sanders. What are his pros and what are his cons from a libertarian standpoint? Will, let's start with you.
I cut out there for a second, but I assume you just wanted an intro and general thoughts?
General thoughts on Bernie Sanders and just...
Well, I think Will and Andy touched base on a couple of things, and, when it comes to Bernie Sanders, I think that my biggest grievance, one of my grievances with him, is not necessarily him, but a lot of his supporters actually will come out and say he's talking about a lot of the issues that that aren't being discussed, such as wealth inequality, and that's pretty much the whole liberal Democrat spiel, is wealth inequality and the 1%, and that's in a way true, but although he's talking about it, doesn't mean that's necessarily a good thing, and I think that he has the problem. What the problem is a little bit figured out, but his solutions for solving these problems, like all statists and leftists, would just make the problems worse. It's just like Milton Friedman's timely quote of how I forget his exact words, how he says that they confuse the policies with the good intentions and policies with the outcomes and everything. So that's pretty much my beef with him. And then also I'm a little bit more biased against the left as well. So that's my that's my opinions on Bernie Sanders.
If I can interject, I think a lot what bugs me about Bernie Sanders is that.
Just introduce yourself a little bit if you can.
Okay, well, Will Tippins. I am, as you said, I'm not fully acquainted with you and Andy. I've known Jeff through his impassioned rants against the left libertarian movement and just
well, most of us know him.
Yeah, well, just been a fan, but so I'm a recent law graduate, basically stuck in purgatory after taking the bar, and Bernie Sanders is to me just another same talking head, not a whole lot really, not a whole lot special about him, and that's really what bugs me is the comparisons that he gets to someone like Ron Paul as someone who I consider a real outsider. But that being said, he does have some different. He's not as simple, he's not as one-dimensional as a lot of the other candidates that we see kicked around. But so that's just my general take on it. But
okay, so you would say he's different than the rest of them, but he's not the identical, typical politician that we're used to seeing, which I think is fair. Jeff, are you having some connectivity issues?
Oh no, I just needed to get my headset. So you guys.
Oh yeah, cool. Yeah, do that after we start. I guess that means Andy. Let's hear from you.
Yeah, sure. My name is Andy Catherman. I am a software developer, application developer by day, and I am a father by night. And when I have my free time, which is usually never, I'm interested in liberty and economics and ethics. And so I'm happy to be a part of this, and humbled that you guys would think of me to do this with me. So with that said, I'm sure we'll be getting to know each other a lot more throughout the course of this podcast, or whatever we want to call it, screencast. And as far as my thoughts on Bernie Sanders, I think he's definitely. I think there's a couple of things I like to say about Bernie Sanders in general. I think it's interesting that he is in the race at all. He's kind of older, and I think before the whole this run, I think most people would have written him off as kind of a crazy old guy who has messed up hair. But I think it's interesting. Obviously, it's kind of like the Trump effect. There's just something about him and what he's saying, how he's connecting with people, that is somewhat attractive. Now I have tons of things to say negatively about his ignorance on many things morally and economically, but at least he's it's interesting that he's anything but Hillary Clinton, although he probably shares a lot more in common than people think. So I'll leave it at that for this round of commentary.
Sure. No. All right, Jeff, what are your thoughts?
In a lot of ways, it's kind of like the Occupy Wall Street movement, because they have a lot of, as you said, they see issues that should be seen. They diagnose problems. They just can't come up with the solutions that make sense, and they often advocate more of what is actually the root cause of the problem instead of actually doing anything new or different or radical. So to me, that's the frustration. The frustrating part is just it's sort of circular of his supporters laud him as some sort of new wave thinking type of guy, but he's a revolutionary without revolutionary ideas, I guess.
I think that's kind of a funny thing that I'll see is that I'll hear his campaign and his supporters say that it's a grassroots campaign, and it's like, you got to make up your mind. It's either a grassroots campaign or he's a socialist statist Democrat. You can't have both. Ron Paul was grassroots because you saw people, I remember seeing Ron Paul for the first time. I was on the freeway, someone made a homemade marker sign, Google Ron Paul, and that's the first time I heard of it. And someone who calls in for more government intervention is at
anything
odds
but
with being
iconoclast,
grassroots.
right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Cool. Well, let me,
Google Bernie Sanders and what are the big, what's the big idea? I mean, what's
all right. Let me jump in so we can